Old Blue Eyes took plenty of dark secrets to his grave, but there was one infamous list he made sure to whisper about before he checked out the 5 Hollywood leading ladies with the absolute worst hygiene. Most superstars protect their lovers' reputations, but not Frank. He spilled the tea on this scandalous topic every chance he got, refusing to let these dirty little secrets die with him. You have to understand the man's psyche. The chairman of the board wasn't just a singer. He was a meticulous perfectionist, a total control freak, and hypersensitive to his environment. He was obsessively attuned to every sight, sound, and especially every smell. He actually maintained a mental blacklist, a do not touch roster of Tinseltown's elite. This list contained the names of Hollywood's most glamorous sirens who failed to meet his impossibly high standards for personal cleanliness and grooming. According to his longtime valet, Frank's routine was borderline obsessive. We are talking about a man who changed his entire outfit at least 3 times a day and hit the showers religiously, both before and immediately after any intimacy. His grooming habits were legendary. It has been said that his private collection of colognes and imported aftershaves was expansive. In fact, the contents of his bathroom counter were likely worth more than the mortgage on your average family home. Frank's nose wasn't just a facial feature. It was the dictator of his existence. It ruled his daily routine and unfortunately completely sabotaged his romantic relationships time and time again. Picture the scene. It is 2 a.m. behind closed doors with his trusted inner circle gathered around. With the scotch pouring like water, Sinatra would hold court, unleashing brutal, unfiltered reviews of his famous lovers that were so savage they would make even the nastiest modern gossip bloggers blush in embarrassment. Absolutely nothing was sacred or off limits, especially when the conversation turned to his biggest pet peeves. He went straight for what he considered the ultimate unforgivable cardinal sin for a woman having any kind of offensive body odour. One member of his entourage remembers the duality vividly. Frank would be on stage charming the audience, kissing a leading lady's hand and calling her darling with that $1 million smile. But the second they got back to the hotel suite, the mask dropped. He would spend an hour ranting about her repulsive stench while practically scrubbing the skin off his hands at the sink to remove the scent. So tonight we are cracking the vault wide open. We are exposing the 5 Oscar-winning screen legends who earned the top spots on Sinatra's secret nasal nightmare list. These were women worshipped by the public as flawless Hollywood goddesses, but their public images masked a dirty truth. Behind closed doors, Sinatra described them as walking olfactory horrors. And let's be clear, this isn't just idle speculation. We aren't dealing with second-hand whispers or internet rumours here. These rankings come straight from the people who were in the room, the ones who heard Frank's slurred, unfiltered, late-night confessions firsthand. And honestly, these stories reveal a lot more than just a guy with a sensitive nose. They shine a light on the pathological need for control that fueled all his relationships. It was a need so intense it drove his interactions and ultimately torpedoed his most meaningful connections. His drummer of 15 years summed it up perfectly, noting, Frank could control absolutely everything in his world. At the stage lighting, the tempo of the band, even the temperature of the room. But he couldn't control his own heart, and that lack of control absolutely enraged him. So whenever a woman really got under his skin emotionally, he would find some physical flaw to fixate on as a defense mechanism. It was a twisted pattern. The stronger his feelings were for her, the crueler and more vicious his assessment became. No one made Sinatra feel more deeply than these 5 women, which means nobody suffered the brunt of his sensory wrath more severely than they did. So buckle up, because we are about to dive deep into the specific details. These are the hygiene horror stories that kept Sinatra awake at night. Number 5, Shelley Winters. She was wild, loud and completely unpredictable. Frank didn't mince words about their time together. He famously said that kissing her was comparable to licking an ashtray wrapped in a wet dog. Shelley Winters burst into Sinatra's world back in 1950 like a human hand grenade. She was the polar opposite of everything he was. She was uncensored, totally uninhibited, and completely uninterested in the suffocating level of perfection that Frank demanded from everyone around him. While Sinatra was the type of guy who probably pressed his pants while he was still wearing them just to stay sharp, Winters was the type to roll out of bed and throw on whatever wrinkled clothes happened to be littering her floor. It wasn't just dislike, it was fear. Frank was genuinely terrified. A makeup artist who worked with both icons explained that Frank couldn't handle Shell's chaotic energy. She was a force of nature he couldn't tame. Her living space was legendary for all the wrong reasons. Her apartment reportedly looked like a tornado had touched down inside a thrift shop. She would wear the same dress for 3 days straight without a second thought. She would chow down on garlic and then laugh right in your face. To Frank, her entire existence felt like psychological warfare against his pristine, manicured standards. Naturally, their brief affair burned incredibly hot and then crashed in spectacular fashion. While Sinatra played nice in public, blaming incompatible schedules for the split in private, he launched into detailed, vicious critiques of Winters' personal habits that became the stuff of legend among his crew, even though she was undeniable talent. And brilliant on screen, off screen was a different story. A longtime member of the entourage revealed that her apartment allegedly smelled like a mix of old soup and stale hairspray. Frank simply couldn't stomach the mess. According to insiders, he would rush back to his penthouse and immediately jump into a scalding shower, scrubbing himself raw for 45 minutes while ranting about being contaminated by the outside world. Decades later, Shelley Winters confessed with a mischievous grin that she had intentionally triggered the crooner's legendary germophobia just to get a rise out of him. I knew it absolutely drove him up the wall whenever I ate with my bare hands. She confided to a close friend years down the line, reveling in the memory of his discomfort. So naturally, I would scan the menu and order the stickiest, messiest dishes I could find, ribs, wings, anything that guaranteed a disaster. In her eyes, the man was simply too pristine, too polished. Someone had to come along and smudge that perfect tuxedo just a little bit. Needless to say, with a dynamic like that, their romantic entanglement was destined to crash and burn before it even really took flight. As Sinatra reportedly grumbled to his valet later on, their fling in the 1950s was brief, volatile, and fortunately the lingering scent of her chaos didn't last as long as the memories. He firmly believed that a gentleman should never disrespect a lady, but in private, his patience for what he considered unladylike hygiene was non-existent. Number 4, Zsa Gabor. The Hungarian socialite dripped with old money glamour, but Frank often quipped that her heavy perfume was potent enough to evacuate a crowded ballroom in seconds. If Shelley Winters was the embodiment of Sinatra's nightmare regarding natural earthly grunge, then the Hungarian bombshell Zsa Gabor sat on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. She represented a suffocating cloud of synthetic luxury that assaulted his senses just as aggressively as any garbage dump could. It was a chemical warfare of floral notes that completely overwhelmed his notoriously sensitive and finicky nose. Rumour had it she practically marinated herself in Chanel, dusting layers of powder over it and reapplying the concoction every 20 minutes like clockwork. Sinatra was heard venting to his bandmates after a particularly stifling date night, claiming he felt like he was being smothered by a bouquet of toxic flowers. I honestly couldn't tell if I was out to dinner with a beautiful woman or wandering endlessly through the perfume aisle of a duty-free shop, he joked. Their whirlwind romance managed to survive for about 6 weeks in 1954, which was roughly 5 weeks longer than Sinatra's sinuses were actually willing to endure. His personal assistant later revealed that Frank would often come home from evenings with Gabor looking visibly physically distressed. He would stumble through the door with bloodshot, watery eyes and a silk handkerchief pressed firmly against his nose, gasping for fresh air. Behind all that glitz and glamour, she's walking around in a cloud of chemical warfare. Sinatra told his inner circle, shaking his head in disbelief. He claimed the fragrance was so aggressive that it clung to his wardrobe with a persistence that defied the laws of physics. It got so bad that he once reportedly took a $600 tuxedo and threw it into the fireplace rather than attempting to have it cleaned again. The dry cleaner couldn't kill it, he insisted. Nothing on this earth could scrub that smell out of the fibres. That perfume had the survival instincts of a cockroach. It could probably withstand a nuclear winter and still smell like gardenias. The absolute final straw occurred during a getaway weekend in Palm Springs when Gabor thought it would be romantic to spritz her signature scent all over his pillowcases. Sinatra was so repulsed that he slept in a guest bedroom down the hall and promptly ended the relationship over breakfast the very next morning. Frank swore he could actually taste her perfume in his morning eggs 3 days after he'd last seen her, recalled a private chef who worked at the Sinatra compound. He would send plates back to the kitchen screaming that the food had been contaminated with the essence of Jada. Eventually, the staff realised it was purely psychological, but when you worked for the chairman of the board, you never questioned his senses if you wanted to keep your paycheck. Number 3, Judy Garland. Frank had an immense respect for her powerhouse talent, but he could not stand her chaotic energy or the unique odour that seemed to accompany it. He famously described her as a nervous breakdown, walking around in high heels, and claimed she carried the scent of that stress in her very sweat. The bond between Frank Sinatra and Judy Garland went far deeper than a typical Hollywood romance. It was a connection forged in the fires of stardom. They recognised the same dark demons in one another, the crushing insecurities and the self-destructive habits that plagued them both. Whenever they performed together, they created absolute magic, delivering moments that would go down in entertainment history as legendary. However, once the curtain fell and the doors closed, Sinatra found himself unable to cope with the physical reality of Garland's internal turmoil. Benzedrine bourbon and stage panic is a cocktail that simply does not mix well. Sinatra told his entourage after a grueling week with Garland in 1954. The duets we sing are electric, sure, but the atmosphere in that dressing room, it's suffocating. According to those within his closest circle, Sinatra's obsession with Garland's scent was actually a deflection from his own deep-seated fears. His complaints about her were a mirror reflecting his terror of confronting his own battles with addiction and anxiety. In her tragic spiral, he saw a terrifying reflection of what he could become if he let his own guard down for even a second. Frank was running as fast as he could from the same demons that were slowly catching up with Judy, explained his longtime road manager. When he ranted about her smell, he wasn't just talking about hygiene, he was talking about the scent of his own fear. His loyal road manager later revealed the tragic truth, confessing that Frank was desperately trying to outrun the exact same destructive inner monsters that were relentlessly hunting down Judy. Whenever he made those haunting comments about the way she smelled, he was never actually talking about her fragrance. He was projecting the suffocating stench of his own paralysing fear. She was the walking definition of chaos, the embodiment of what happened when you let go of the wheel. And for Frank, maintaining control was the only thing that mattered. When old Blue Eyes reminisced about Judy Garland, his recollection of her personal scent shifted from romantic affection to something coldly, brutally medical. As their turbulent relationship spiraled deeper, his descriptions became increasingly clinical, analysing her aroma like a scientist studying a volatile compound. He would break down her essence into a disturbing formula, categorising every olfactory component with the sharp precision of a pharmacist. According to his nose, she was 40% prescription pharmaceuticals, 30% sheer terror, 20% stale booze, and 10% genius, burning itself out. The twisted irony in all this was that Sinatra was fighting identical demons, battling addiction to pills, drowning in alcohol, and suffering from crippling stage fright, but he channeled his management of these disasters into a pathological obsession with hygiene and order rather than surrendering to the mess. What made Garland's placement on Sinatra's list of scent offenders so heartbreaking was the fact that he genuinely loved her perhaps more authentically than any woman he ever knew, aside from his final wife. However, his profound psychological inability to separate the human being from the sensory experience created a wall between them that he simply couldn't climb over. He tried to wash away the memory of that scent, distracting himself with domestic hobbies to cleanse his palate. But no matter how much he scrubbed, the sensory details of his lovers haunted him, leading him straight to the next name on his list. Marilyn Monroe. Yes, the Marilyn. Frank was absolutely infatuated with her, yet he remained brutally honest about her flaws behind closed doors. He once confided in a close friend, dropping the bombshell that she smelled like beauty starting to rot from the inside out. In Frank's world, her scent was a mix of exhaustion, nervous panic sweats, and layers of melting cosmetics that created a sickly decay he couldn't ignore. No entry on Sinatra's olfactory blacklist shocked his inner circle more than his disdain for the aroma of Marilyn Monroe. She was America's ultimate fantasy, the sex symbol whose poster graced the walls of every army barracks and corporate boardroom in the country. Yet for Frank, she was a sensory disappointment of epic proportions, a reality check that he couldn't reconcile with the visual masterpiece she presented to the world. Frank felt entitled to a Marilyn who smelled exactly like the fantasy she projected, explained a makeup artist who worked with both legends, expecting an impossible blend of pure vanilla raw sexuality and untouched innocence. When he was confronted with the fact that she was a biological woman with real bodily functions, his brain simply couldn't process the discrepancy. Their short-lived romantic fling, back in 1961, happened right as Monroe was spiraling deeper into her dependency on a heavy prescription, medications and alcohol substances that Sinatra insisted warped her natural skin chemistry into something he found increasingly repulsive. She was a global icon, sure, but even icons sweat through their silk dresses. Sinatra sneered to a tiny gathering of his most trusted confidants. He would go on to describe with near forensic detail how Monroe's meticulously crafted glamorous exterior would slowly degrade over the course of a long day. The heavy foundation sliding off her face, the perspiration building up, and the chemical reek of a pharmacy seeping out through her pores. Frank ruthlessly compared her smell to a high-end department store just an hour before closing time, remembered a member of his entourage. It was that stale mixture of expensive perfumes clashing with tired human reality after the air conditioning has failed. What made the Monroe case particularly revealing was Sinatra's total incapacity to distinguish his idealized fantasy of her from the biological reality of her existence. His complaints focused specifically on the massive gap between what he expected to smell and what he actually experienced, the cognitive dissonance between the perfect image on the screen and the imperfect human in his arms. Frank simply couldn't forgive Marilyn for the crime of being mortal, observed his longtime physician. He had built her up as this flawless creation, and the moment she produced a normal human sense, that illusion was shattered forever. It really wasn't about her hygiene at all. It was about his own impossible, delusional expectations of perfection. But if you think his standards were high for them, wait until you hear about the woman who truly wrecked him. Number one was Ava Gardner, the absolute love of his life, and the one who, according to Frank, smelled like war itself. Their passion was akin to a nuclear explosion. The fights were legendary, but he told friends that Ava was nothing but gin, cigarette smoke, and fury. The chairman of the board once famously claimed he wasn't a quitter. Yet when it came to her, he admitted he could barely draw a breath in her presence. It wasn't just his heart she shattered into a million pieces. She seemingly wrecked his sinuses too. Let's be honest, no woman ever hijacked Frank Sinatra's senses quite like the bombshell Ava Gardner. Their romance was a total hurricane stretching from a tempestuous marriage through decades of messy aftermath that defined the central emotional conflict of his entire life. The truth is, the man never truly purged her from his system, and if you ask his inner circle, he spent the rest of his life gripping about her aroma to anyone who would listen. His road manager put it bluntly, Ava wasn't just a girlfriend, she was Frank's full-blown addiction. And just like a junkie hooked on the hard stuff, he developed a vicious love-hate dynamic with his narcotic of choice. All that fixation on her odour. It was just a smokescreen for how utterly powerless he felt whenever she walked into the room. Since he couldn't dictate his own erratic emotions, he went overboard, trying to micromanage his physical environment instead. As time marched on, Sinatra's descriptions of Gardner's scent morphed from simple gripes into elaborate twisted poetry. What started out as basic complaints about the stench of stale cigarettes and booze eventually turned into detailed taxonomies of how she assaulted his senses. These laundry lists of grievances said a hell of a lot more about his fragile mental state than they ever did about her actual hygiene. When he was deep in his cups, usually after downing a few too many Jack Daniels, he would characterize her smell as the literal perfume of self-destruction, a scent he found equally revolting and impossible to resist. Frank once famously quipped that kissing Ava was akin to licking a dirty ashtray while getting sucker punched right in the soul, a line recalled by a musician who toured with him in the 1960s. However, witnesses say he would get this specific haunted glaze in his eyes, saying it looking like he was talking about a poison he needed more than he needed oxygen. The thing that set Gardner apart from the endless parade of dames on Sinatra's list was his deep-seated confusion. With the other girls, if he complained about a smell, it was a clear-cut sign to get out, a straightforward rejection. But with Gardner, those insults were tangled up with his burning, unending desire, a messy complexity that continued to torture him long after the divorce papers were signed. His longtime shrink noted that he never really solved the puzzle of Ava, and that lack of closure manifested in this weird physical fixation. He was able to easily toss other women aside by claiming they reeked. Yet with Ava, the odour was actually part of the reason he couldn't let go, as if her signature scent had seared itself into his skin. Gardner stayed permanently at the #1 spot on Sinatra's olfactory enemies list until the day he died, not because she actually smelled worse than anyone else, but because that sensory memory was buried the deepest in his psyche, becoming completely intertwined with his massive emotional vulnerability. It was the ultimate battle for a man who needed to dominate everything. He simply couldn't handle the chaos she brought into his meticulously ordered life. This was the chairman's final stand. You have to understand, Frank Sinatra built his entire legendary existence on the concept of control. He manipulated his vocal cords with the precision of a master mechanic. He commanded entire rooms just by walking in, and he micromanaged his image right down to the exact millimetre fold of his silk pocket square. He kept a stranglehold on his live performances through neurotic rehearsals, absolutely terrorising band members who flubbed a note, or lighting guys who missed a cue by a second. But the one wild card Frank Sinatra could never tame was his own beating heart. His weird obsession with how women smelled was never actually about cleanliness, according to his psychiatrist. It was purely a mechanism for emotional self-defense. Whenever a woman managed to slip past his armor when she made him feel an emotion that he couldn't strictly regulate, he would instantly retreat into these hypercritical sensory judgments. In his mind, it was infinitely safer to say she smells terrible than to admit she makes me feel weak. This toxic pattern reared its ugly head most dramatically whenever a woman threatened to destabilize his emotional balance. It was almost a mathematical certainty. The more power a woman held over Sinatra's fragile feelings, the faster she would end up on his personal olfactory blacklist. It wasn't because she actually carried an unpleasant odour or lacked hygiene. That was just the cover story. The real issue was that she had managed to breach the heavy fortifications he had spent a lifetime building around his heart. You have to understand that Frank didn't just have senses. He weaponized his sensitivity according to a sound engineer who spent decades in the trenches working right alongside him. The man was a sensory genius. His ears could pick out a single violin playing a slightly flat note in a 40-piece orchestra. His palate was so refined he could identify the specific hillside a grape was grown on during a blind wine tasting. And his nose was sharp enough to distinguish between different cologne brands from all the way across a crowded banquet hall. But these weren't just impressive parlour tricks. They were sophisticated mechanisms of control designed to keep the world at arm's length. By reducing these messy, complex emotional connections down to simple, petty sensory complaints, Sinatra manufactured an illusion of choice in relationships where he actually felt helpless. In his twisted narrative, he wasn't the one being rejected or vulnerable. It was simply a matter of biology. Their natural scents were incompatible with his high-class, refined sensibilities. It was a convenient fiction, a lie constructed specifically to shield his massive ego from the terrifying reality of emotional dependency. The truth is, the women who ended up on his bad smell list were invariably the exact same women who made him feel something genuine and terrifying, concluded his longtime road manager. The stronger the feelings involved, the more elaborate and nasty the complaint became. That is exactly why Ava Gardner topped that list. She didn't just borrow his heart, she colonized it completely, and blaming his nose was just a convenient scapegoat. The real stench in this situation has nothing to do with hygiene. It comes from the rot of fame, unchecked influence, and the lack of consequences. The truest stink in this entire saga isn't coming from the perfume of 5 legendary actresses. It is emanating from a toxic cocktail of unbridled male power, a legion of enabling yes men, and Hollywood's machinery designed to manufacture selective truths. Frank. Sinatra was able to get away with these private assessments of famous women precisely because the entire system was rigged to protect men like him, cultural deities whose immense commercial value acted like a bulletproof vest, insulating them from ever facing the consequences of their private behaviour. Nobody ever told Frank no, explained a female studio executive who survived working with Sinatra in the 1960s. Not his tough-as-nails mother, and certainly not the movie studios once he started bringing in the big bucks. And most definitely not the posse of men who surrounded him day and night. He lived in a bubble completely void of accountability, where his perceptions, no matter how warped by insecurity or ego, were treated as the absolute objective reality. The guys in Sinatra's inner circle who served as the primary sources for these supposed olfactory judgments were just participating in a common dynamic of male celebrity culture, reinforcing the star's twisted perspective, regardless of whether it had any relationship to the truth. We all just laughed along when Frank went on these tirades about how women smelled, admitted a long-time member of his entourage years later. Even when they knew it was total garbage, and even when they had been with the same woman and noticed nothing but expensive perfume. Your job in Frank's court wasn't to be a fact checker or to challenge him. It was to nod your head and validate whatever narrative was necessary to protect his fragile self-image. This dynamic created a hermetically sealed information system where Sinatra's subjective experiences, coloured by his deep-seated insecurities, hypersensitivity, and desperate need for control, became codified as gospel fact within his circle, eventually transmuting into Hollywood legend long after his death. Meanwhile, the women who were subjected to these cruel assessments were operating under completely different rules, expected to maintain flawless angelic public images while secretly navigating the brutal private realities of stress, exhaustion, and the physical demands of Hollywood's relentless and unforgiving beauty standards. Let's get real about what life was actually like on those glamorous sets. We are talking about grueling 16-hour shifts where these ladies were practically baked alive under blazing studio lights. Imagine being laced up tight in suffocating corsets, dealing with crushing anxiety and barely sleeping, yet still having to project an image of effortless elegance every single second. One costume designer who dressed all 5 of these legends spilled the tea, noting that the real shocker wasn't that they occasionally broke a sweat or needed a spritz of strong perfume. The true miracle is that they managed to look like absolute goddesses while enduring working conditions that would make a grown man crumble. But here is where the story gets messy. Because of his massive clout, Frank Sinatra got to play judge, jury, and executioner regarding these women's hygiene, while nobody dared to take a magnifying glass to his own nasty habits. Let's not forget the chairman of the board wasn't exactly smelling like roses. We are talking about stale cigarette breath mixed with the stench of booze oozing out of his pores. During his sweaty live performances, he was a cocktail of odours, not to mention the pharmacy of uppers and downers he popped just to keep up with his punishing lifestyle. As his own doctor pointed out, Frank never had to live up to the impossible cleanliness standards he demanded from his lovers. No one was out there writing hit pieces about his body odour or making detailed lists of his gross sensory offences. His power was a shield, protecting him from the kind of scrutiny he so casually inflicted on the women he claimed to adore. The privilege of being the boss meant his body was off limits while he treated women's bodies like public property to be critiqued. And that right there is the dirty little secret behind Sinatra's infamous list. The real scandal isn't about whether a Hollywood starlet skipped a shower. It is about a rigged system that let one powerful man's subjective and frankly hypocritical nose dictate the narrative. These women were trapped in a game they couldn't win, labelled by a man who faced zero consequences for his own mess. It wasn't about hygiene, it was about a power dynamic where women had absolutely no platform to clap back or defend themselves. But in the end, karma has a way of working things out. The ultimate twist in this sordid Hollywood tale is that Frank's petty attempt to reduce these icons to nothing more than a bad smell completely backfired. Despite his legendary status, he couldn't tarnish their shine. History doesn't care about his nose, it cares about their brilliance. We don't remember them for how they smelled. We remember them for their massive cultural footprint, their undeniable talent, and the art they left behind. Just look at the scoreboard. Shelley Winters didn't just survive, she thrived, snagging 2 Academy Awards and crafting unforgettable characters over a career that spanned decades. And Judy Garland, she gave us performances so raw and powerful that they still bring grown men to tears almost a century later. Then you have Marilyn Monroe, who went way beyond being just a movie star. She became the ultimate global icon, a face known in every corner of the planet. Ava Gardner was no slouch either. Her fierce talent and wild independent spirit proved she was a force of nature far more than just a pretty face for Frank to obsess over. Even Zsa Zsa Gabor, who people love to hate as being famous for being famous, was actually a genius at branding. She practically invented the celebrity persona, paving the way for the reality TV stars of 2026 decades before it was cool. On the flip side, Sinatra's private little insults kept alive by his loyal boys club actually tell us way more about him than the women he tried to tear down. As one film historian specialising in the Golden Age put it, the women outlived the insults. Frank thought he was keeping a scorecard of their flaws, but all he really did was document his own blindness. He couldn't see them as real, complex human beings. To him, they were just sensory toys meant for his consumption, not actual people. For all the praise heaped on his voice and artistry, emotionally, Frank was stuck in high school. He had this fundamentally immature way of dealing with women, putting them on a pedestal and worshipping them as perfect fantasies. But the second they showed they were flesh and blood with sweat sense and bodily functions, he recoiled in disgust like a petulant child. His own psychiatrist hit the nail on the head. Frank was in love with the image, never the reality. As soon as a woman stopped being a projection of his desires and started existing as a real person, he took it as a personal betrayal. It wasn't his sensitive nose that was the problem, folks. It was his complete lack of emotional maturity. Frank Sinatra wanted dolls, not women, and that is the sad truth behind the swagger. The history books have closed on this one, and the ladies definitely won. While Frank was busy sniffing for imperfections, these women were busy becoming legends. It just goes to show that true talent outlasts petty gossip every single time. So next time you hear about the Rat Pack glamour, remember the grit these women had to show just to survive it. Because standing under those hot lights while a powerful man judges your scent takes a strength Frank never had. Their legacy is built on endurance and art, while his complaints are just footnotes of a fragile ego. At the end of the day, they were the main characters of their own stories, not just supporting roles in his. And that is a wrap on the real story behind the scandal. The scent of success is the only thing that lingers for these queens. Frank's nose might have been famous, but his heart was the part that was missing. Shelley Winters, Zsa Zsa Gabor, Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe and Ava Gardner have all long since left this world, leaving them unable to stand up and defend themselves against these ridiculous sensory accusations. However, the sheer weight of their artistic legacies makes any verbal defence completely unnecessary. Their incredible body of work speaks volumes, rising far above the petty, superficial judgments of a man who, despite his God-given musical talents, never really matured enough to stop reducing complex three-dimensional women to simple sensory complaints. In the grand courtroom of history, raw talent is the only thing that delivers the final verdict. And by that standard, these 5 Hollywood legends don't just survive Sinatra's rumoured olfactory blacklist, they completely obliterate it. This was the icon who crooned about flying to the moon, touching the distant stars and drifting beyond the deep blue sea, creating the ultimate soundtrack for American romance, yet he crumbled when faced with the earthy reality of actual intimacy. Frank Sinatra's whispered list of leading ladies with offensive personal sense reveals absolutely nothing about these 5 women, but it tells us everything about the man who wrote it. He was a total control freak whose extreme sensitivities made him a genius in the recording booth, but an absolute nightmare as a romantic partner. His brutal, unfiltered critiques preserved and passed down through the loyalty of his exclusively male entourage, the Rat Pack, document the massive canyon between Sinatra's cool, sophisticated public image and his emotionally stunted private behaviour. The superstar, who projected an aura of unshakable confidence, actually fell apart when he encountered normal human imperfections, quickly retreating into hypercritical complaints about smells rather than admitting he was terrified of his own vulnerability. The women on his hit list: Shelley Winters, Zize, Gabor Judy, Garland the Immortal, Marilyn Monroe and Ava Gardner remain unshakable pillars of Hollywood's golden age, their brilliance and cultural impact completely undiminished by messy posthumous gossip regarding their personal hygiene habits. If anything, Sinatra's weird fixation on their physical traits just spotlights his fundamental failure to look past surface-level details and connect with the complex human beings underneath. By obsessing over exactly how these women supposedly smelled, Sinatra was really just mapping out the borders of his own emotional limitations, pinpointing the exact moments where each woman had penetrated the armour of a man who was determined to micromanage every single thing in his environment, including the messy business of his own heart. The real headline isn't that 5 legendary actresses might have sweated under hot lights, worn strong perfume, or carried the scent of life. The true scandal is that America's most celebrated male voice, a man who could squeeze more heartbreak out of a single lyric than most singers manage in a lifetime, remained emotionally comprised in his private relationships, completely unable to reconcile his dream world fantasies of flawless perfection with the biological truths of real living women. Frank Sinatra may have catalogued their sense, but these 5 women left the more enduring mark, not as fleeting olfactory experiences, but as timeless artists whose work continues to captivate audiences long after both their physical presence and Sinatra's petty grievances have faded into the background of Hollywood mythology.